Osio Nagad, welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe. My name is Gayle Ross and I am Cherokee. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, second largest native tribe in America, second only to our Navajo brothers and sisters in the Southwest. Now, the Cherokee people were originally from the Smoky Mountains in America, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, North Alabama. But many, many years ago, in the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson was president and my great-great-great-grandfather, John Ross, was principal chief, we were forcibly moved away from our beautiful mountain homeland to west of the Mississippi, what was then called Indian Territory, but is northeast Oklahoma today. The 14 northeasternmost counties in Oklahoma are the Cherokee Tribal Jurisdictional Area, and our capital is in Tahlequah. Now, Earth Day is a very special celebration, so I thought I'd begin by telling you the story of how our mountains were formed. You see, in the beginning days of the world, everything was water. There was no land at all, and all creatures that lived above the sky vault, this polished blue stone that curves from horizon to horizon. But it was beginning to get crowded in the upper world, and Uneklana, creator, said he would make a home in the middle world. So one by one, birds began to fly. Each day, a different bird would leave the land above, fly down to this middle world, and fly in all four directions. And then they would return and say, no, there's nothing there but water. And then the little water beetle, she flew down. And when she had flown in all four directions, she was tired. And so she rested there, floating on the surface of the water. And as she did, she suddenly wondered what was underneath the water. So she gathered all her strength, dove and swam to the bottom of the sea, and there was mud there. So she scooped up one tiny little handful of mud and brought it back and set it floating on top of the water. And then she returned to the world above. And that little handful of mud that the little water beetle carried that day began to stretch and grow until it became this continent that we walk upon. But it was still soft, soft mud, like the ocean floor. You couldn't walk on the land. And so once again, the birds began to fly. Every day, a different bird would fly down from the world above and fly in all four directions. And one by one, they would return to say that no, the earth was still too soft. And then it was Buzzard's turn to fly. And when Buzzard had flown in all four directions and found that the earth was still soft, he grew angry and impatient. And he began to fly very close to the earth, pushing the air with his wings, drying out the land. And when he came to Cherokee country, he was tired, and he flew a little too close to the earth. And his wings began to strike the earth, and there the valleys were carved. And where his wings rose, the tall mountains grew. And so the homeland of the Cherokee people were those beautiful mountains that Buzzard made that day. Now, all creatures came down from the world above to make of this middle world a home. And there were many things that had to be done. The very first, the people went to Grandmother's son, who lives above the sky vault, and every day she agreed to slip under the eastern edge of the sky vault and walk a path through the heavens, bringing her light and her warmth to the world. And her brother, Uncle Moon, he brought his soft and gentle light to the evening sky. But even with Grandmother's sun in the heavens by day and Uncle Moon smiling at night, the world was still cold and dark. There was no fire. Now thunder lives in the west, controls the wind and the rain and the lightning. He saw that fire would make the lives of the people much better, but it was not a gift to be given lightly. It must be earned. And so he sent lightning to strike a hollow tree on an island in the middle of a great lake. And the first fire was kindled there in the base of that tree. Now, everyone gathered on the shores of the lake. Everyone wanted to be remembered as the bringer of fire. And they let Bear go first. After all, Bear was the biggest and the strongest. But when he had swum to the island, he saw a split in the tree and he could see the flames inside. So he squeezed himself into that tree and he began to cough and choke. And before he could squeeze his way back out of that tree, he had burned black from the tip of his nose to the tip of his tail. And the bear in the Smoky Mountains is black to this day. And he returned without the fire. Next, the people said the wisest should go, and that was Grandmother Owl. She flew across to the island, and she landed on top of that tree and looked down. Just as a gust of hot smoke and ash blew up through that tree like it was a chimney, and Grandmother Owl's eyes were burned, and the ashes made great white rings on her face. And she returned without the fire, and she wears those white rings to this day. Then the little racer snake was chosen. He was very swift. He swam across to the island, but when he went in the bottom of the tree, now there was a bed of dark coals burning, and he was burned black before he could make his way back outside that tree. Many creatures tried and failed, and then the people heard one tiny voice speaking up. It was the little water spider, the one that does that dance on the rivers and the streams. Everyone laughed at her because she was so small. But she insisted that she had the right to try, and so they let her go. She danced her way to the island, and she didn't rush in as the others had done. She sat down outside that tree and began to spin her web thread around and around and around until she had made a little tiny bowl. She tied that bowl on her back, and reaching in, she took one tiny coal of fire, placed it in her bowl, and danced back to the people. And they say from that tiny little coal that Grandmother Spider carried on that day were all 7 sacred fires of the Cherokee lit. Now, sacred fire burned in the townhouses of the 7 Cherokee peace towns, tended at all times, never allowed to go out, every year at green corn dance time, when the world is made new. The old fire is swept away from the hearth, a new fire is laid, but it is lit very carefully with coals from the sacred fire the year before. So you see, in that way, that living fire has been handed down from one generation to the next. When we made that long, long journey There were those who carried coals from the sacred fire. They're still burning down in the hills of northeast Oklahoma. And when you see that little tiny spider today, she's very popular. Her drawing is one of the Cherokee artists' most beloved symbols. That little spider still has that white ring on her back. It's her badge of honor. And it's there so that we remember that the greatest gifts don't always come from the biggest or strongest or wisest or bravest or swiftest. Sometimes they come from the smallest and gentlest of our animal brothers and sisters. Wado. Now you see, Cherokee people, well, you probably know this already. All Indian people aren't alike. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes in America. And we're all very different from one to another. Our people, the Cherokee people, are what we call Southeast Woodlands culture. We're very different from, say, the Pueblo people in the Southwest or the Plains people, like the Lakota and the Cheyenne. But one thing we have in common is this understanding that we are guardians of our beautiful Mother Earth. And people need to listen to the teachings of Native peoples all around the world, because right now we need to heal our mother so that she can take care of us. Another thing that we have in common is storytelling. From tribe to tribe, we all have our stories that explain our relationship with all things, that show how everything is alive and all living things are related. And when I was first beginning to learn and tell Cherokee stories, this story I found written down in some of my grandmother's papers. I don't remember her ever telling it to me, and I wish she had. It would have made me feel better. It's about a bird with big feet. You can't see them, but I have big feet. And when I was a kid, I thought my big feet were really ugly. And I think maybe we all have something about the way we look that we think is not quite right. And for you young people, this is a traditional Cherokee story about how that feels. You see, long ago, the meadowlark, beautiful bird, meadowlark, he wouldn't fly with the other birds. He wouldn't roost in the trees and sing with the other birds. Meadowlark spent his days hiding in the tall grass where no one could see him. And he sat there, sulking, feeling sorry for himself, saying things like, "These feet, they're meant to be eagle's feet because they're too big for me." And he was sitting there that day, just looking at his feet, feeling sorry for himself, when a grasshopper came along. Have you ever noticed how busy the little bug people are? They're always scurrying this way and that. You never see a little bug person just kicking back and chilling. And that's the way it was with that grasshopper. He came hopping along through the tall grass and boom, he bumped smack into Meadowlark. He picked himself up. He shook himself off. He said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. You're a bird. Birds live in the trees. I'm a bug. Bugs live on the ground. I'm supposed to be here, but you're not supposed to be here. What are you doing?" Meadowlark said, "I'm afraid to come out where the others can see me. They will laugh at my feet. Grasshopper said, your feet, what's so funny about your feet? I never saw a foot do anything. Ooh, I see your point. Still, you don't fly with your feet, you fly with your wings. You don't sing with your feet, you sing with your voice. You're a bird. Act like one. And having delivered that little bit of advice, Grasshopper went about his day. And Meadowlark, he thought about the words that Grasshopper had spoken, and finally he thought, you know, maybe I'm being silly. Maybe nobody will even notice my feet. So he flew out of the tall grass to the top of a tree. He threw back his head and he started to sing. Degano Kichishwa, Degano Kichishwa, Degano Kichishwa, Chisqua Usti. The bird is singing, the bird is singing, the bird is singing, little bird. Now you know, of all the gifts that Creator had given Meadowlark, that beautiful yellow vest, that little black and white necklace he wears around his throat, of all the gifts Creator gave Meadowlark, the most beautiful one was his voice. Everyone gathered at the foot of the tree, looking up at this wonderful singer. All the birds fell quiet, gathered in the treetops, listening to Meadowlark sing. So when he opened his eyes and saw everybody looking at him, I think you can probably guess what he thought they were looking at. His feet. He flew back down to the tall grass, and this time nothing anyone could say would make him come out. Now, as wise as Grasshopper is, he was wrong about one thing. There are birds that live on the ground, and one of them is the little bobwhite, the little quail. And there was a little mother quail that accidentally built her nest in a field of wheat that the human beings had planted. Every day she sat on her nest and she watched as the wheat grew taller, and she began to worry that the people would come to cut the wheat before her eggs had hatched. And sure enough, one day she heard two people at the edge of the wheat field talking about how everyone in the village would harvest that wheat the very next day. And Mother Quail knew that when the human beings with their big feet walked through that field, someone would step on her nest. They would crush her eggs. She would lose her babies. And so she began to cry and call for someone to help her. Gu-kway, 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 nani-way, 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 nani-way. This is little quail calling. This is little quail calling. And Grasshopper, going about the world on very important business, he heard Mother Quail crying. And he went to her, and when he found out what was wrong, he said, well, we'll just move your eggs. They're not safe in the wheat field. They'll be safe in the tall grass. We'll move them from the wheat field to the tall grass, because they'll be safe in the tall grass. They're not safe in the wheat field. We'll just move your eggs. but little grasshopper and little mother quail. They weren't strong enough to lift the eggs over the side of the nest. A ground nesting bird makes their nest deep and soft and safe. Mother quail was just fixing to start crying again when Grasshopper said, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I know who can help." And he went and got Meadowlark and brought him to that nest. And those big, ugly feet were just big enough to pick up Mother Quail's eggs. So 2 at a time, Meadowlark airlifted Mother Quail's eggs out of the wheat field to the tall grass, and she made a new nest there. And hiding the way he was, Meadowlark watched as Mother Quail tended those eggs so carefully. He watched when the day came that pop, 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 all those eggs hatched. And he watched when the day came that little Mother Quail, her head up so proud and happy, she started off for a walk, and right behind her came that row of beautiful little baby birds, bouncing along like little feathered ping-pong balls. And when Meadowlark saw those beautiful little babies, he looked down and said, "These feet are ugly. I am so proud of them." And Meadowlark, he flew from the tall grass to the top of the tree, and he sang, and if anything, his song was more beautiful than before, because Meadowlark had learned something very important. And I hope it's what you will remember whenever you think of this story. It's not the way you look. It's the way you see. Do you look around the world and do you see a family that you're part of that loves you and you all take care of each other? You look around and see a community, maybe your church, maybe your neighbors, but a community that you're part of, and you look out for each other and you take care of each other. And today it's more important than ever before to look around the world and see we are all related. We are all one family, and we must learn to take care of each other, because it's not the way you look, it's the way you see. Now, that would have been a good story for me to hear when I was a kid, walking around in size 12 feet. And I want to share another story with you. Probably the most important event that we are remembered for, the Cherokee, was that terrible forced removal from our mountain homelands. And like many native tribes, Cherokees have taken that history and woven it into a told story so that it will never be forgotten. I learned this story from one of our Eastern Band Cherokee brothers, the small group of Cherokees who were not removed up in the mountain fastness of North Carolina. They are still there. And of course, they are a federally recognized tribal nation in their own right. So this is a story I learned out east. In May of 1838, the storm that had been for so long gathering broke over the Cherokee Nation. Indian removal. The brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, but the architect was Andrew Jackson. Jackson had made his military reputation that launched him into the presidency on the backs of Indian people, Cherokees, Choctaws, fighting with him, first in the war against the Red Stick Creeks, and then again in the War of 1812. But Jackson, he knew the people of the southeastern states, and he knew they coveted our land. And so right after he was elected, he passed a law called the Indian Removal Bill, calling for all 5 of the southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, to sign treaties, give up their homelands, and move west beyond the Mississippi. And one by one, our neighbors, they gave Jackson a treaty. And one by one, they left. But the Cherokees refused. In the beginning days of the United States, George Washington and then Thomas Jefferson held out an olive branch to Native peoples, saying, "Live more like we do." And the Cherokees accepted the challenge, and their country was transformed. Instead of the traditional village agriculture, great farms and plantations, businesses. There was a Cherokee newspaper using the brilliant syllabary, a way of writing in the Cherokee language that was developed by Sequoyah. And so by the time Andrew Jackson came into office and my great-great-great-grandfather, John Ross, was elected principal chief, the Cherokee Nation was a shining and prosperous land that was coveted by our neighbors in Georgia. You see, Georgia claimed a part of what was our nation for her own. And she was eager for a removal treaty to be signed with the Cherokees. Georgia passed a series of very restrictive laws claiming they applied to us in our own country. No Cherokee could own a gun. No Cherokee could testify in a court. All of these laws meant to dissolve our national identity. And there was horrible violence. Georgia pony soldiers riding across the border at night, beating Cherokee men, raping Cherokee women, burning Cherokee homes. And the Cherokees, they fought back. They didn't go to war, they went to court. And in a landmark Supreme Court decision, the court found on behalf of the Cherokee. The Cherokee are a domestic dependent nation with a government of their own, with an economy of their own, with borders of their own, and Georgia has no power over them. Whereupon Andrew Jackson became the only president in the history of the United States to openly defy the Supreme Court. He is said to have remarked, John Marshall has made his decision as Chief of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice. To the Georgians, he said, light a fire under them. They'll move. And so with the federal government refusing to uphold the terms of our treaties, the Georgian violence increased until finally one small faction of the Cherokees, they gave in. And they signed the treaty that Jackson wanted, the Treaty of New Echota, signed on December 29th, 1835. The Cherokees protested that the treaty was a fraud. It was not signed by any of the leaders who had the right to make such an agreement. But Jackson didn't care. He took it to the Senate, and there it was ratified by one vote. And when the grace period in the treaty had expired, and the Cherokees had still refused to move, the United States Army, led by General Winfield Scott, moved into Cherokee country, rounding up the families, herding them from their homes. All they were allowed to take was what they could carry on their backs. And they were herded into 7 great wooden stockades like cattle, and with inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate sanitation, the people began to fall sick. And in June of 1838, the first detachment of Cherokees were taken from a stockade and sent on their way west. Now, they were originally supposed to go by the river route on flatboats, but it had been a spring and a summer of drought, and the rivers were dry. So they walked, following the rivers in the sickly season, the hot season, and weak from the months in the stockade, they began to die. First the very old, and then the very young. And after days and days of this torment, the hearts of the women broke. They walked as though they could see nothing ahead of them. They walked through the day, some of them carrying the bodies of their little ones because they refused to believe that they were gone. And when the end of the day came, they sat and they stared into a future too bleak to face. And the men, seeing their women, they became frightened, and so they gathered together and they went out in the night to pray. Unetlana, pity us, help us. The strength of the Cherokee people is the strength of our women. If they cannot survive, we will not survive. And they say that Creator took pity on those men and spoke to them, saying, in the morning, tell your women to look back at the trail they have watered with their tears. I will send them a sign. And so the next morning the men told the women what Creator had said, and they felt better. And they went about preparing for the day's march, and as they set foot on the trail, they looked behind them. And there, springing from the ground, were all these beautiful green vines weaving themselves together, stems with 7 leaves, one for each of the 7 clans of the Cherokee. And at the end of each of those stems, a beautiful little white flower. White, the Cherokee color for peace. But in the center of each of those flowers was a little circle of gold. So the Cherokees would never forget. It was greed that had taken them from their land. But seeing those beautiful little flowers growing back along the trail they had followed, springing from the earth, sprouting the leaves, bursting into bloom, the women remembered. As long as there is beauty in the world, there is hope. And so they found the strength to finish their journey. And Chief John Ross, horrified at the death toll mounting, he finally gave in. He went to General Winfield Scott and said, "Let the Cherokee manage their own removal. We will not go herded like a defeated people. We will move like the tribal nation that we are." And Winfield Scott agreed. And so the removal was halted through that summer while all things were made ready for them to undertake that journey. And the trail began again in September. But the worst winter ever recorded struck the Cherokees on the trail. And again, people began to die. But when we reached our new home, the Cherokees, as they had done so many times before, they rose from the ashes like the great bird, the phoenix. And once again, they stood tall. They stood proud. But we tell that story to remember the history and remember the most important thing. As long as there is beauty in the world, there is hope. I want to thank you for joining me for this story time, and I hope you'll come back often to the World Storytelling Cafe and listen to the wonderful storytellers that they have gathered from around the world. Wado. Thank you.
Did you enjoy that storyteller? Of course you did. And if you enjoyed it, like the minstrels of old, we're passing round the hat. And if you have some, whether it's paper or coin, our storytellers would appreciate what you put in. Every penny you put in goes directly to that storyteller through paper. All you have to do is go to worldstorytellingcafe.com. Click on today's stories or click on that storyteller and there'll be a hat below the story. And you can just drop a little in that hat. Well, thank you for listening. And if you can afford it, we'd appreciate it.